What if I told you that the two most uncanny beings in Tolkien's legendarium, the ones that do not quite fit, the ones that Sauron's power could not reach, the ones that the movies either cut entirely or reduced to roaring spectacle, might have been in the same room? Not in any film, not in any novel, but in the deep logic of Tolkien's world, where the rules of age and power and corruption run like bedrock beneath every page he ever wrote. This is not a theory pulled from nothing. This is what happens when you follow the cosmological rules of Middle-earth all the way down, when you take seriously what the text says about what it means to be truly old, when you put together what the letters reveal about Tom Bombadil, what unfinished tales reveals about Smaug's place in Sauron's calculations, and what the Silmarillion reveals about the nature of Morgoth's fire, you get a question the legendarium has never answered. Because nobody has thought to ask it. Did Tom Bombadil and Smaug ever meet? And if they did, which one should have been afraid of the other? Start with what you think you know, because fandom has kept these two figures in very different boxes for a long time. Tom Bombadil is the strange one, the comic one, the singing, yellow-booted oddity who appears for 3 chapters and defeats the One Ring without even trying, and then vanishes from the story as though Tolkien himself lost interest. Smaug is the great dragon, the fire drake of the north, the villain, whose arrogance and cunning fill every scene with a dangerous electricity. One feels like a fairy tale that wandered into the wrong book. The other feels like a nightmare with an IQ. And never the two shall meet. Except that Tolkien's cosmological rules put them on a collision course nobody has ever mapped, because both of them exist outside Sauron's ring in the same fundamental way. And if that is true, then they are connected across the full length and breadth of the legendarium in a way that should make any serious reader of the books stop and sit with it. Here is the thing nobody talks about. Both of them are immune to the One Ring, and that immunity, in each case, comes from the same source. They are too old, too deep, too thoroughly themselves for the ring's corruption to find purchase in their natures. And if both of them stand outside Sauron's hierarchy of power, then the question of what would happen if the oldest thing in Middle-earth encountered the last great dragon of Morgoth's making is one the legendarium has set up without ever intending to answer. Let us build this properly, because the evidence runs in 2 directions, and you need to understand both before the speculation can begin. In the Fellowship of the Ring, in the chapters about Tom Bombadil's house, Tolkien gives us something that should be impossible. Frodo puts on the One Ring, the ring forged in the fire of Mount Doom, the ring that bends the wills of kings, the ring that pulls its wearer out of the visible world and into the shadow realm where Sauron's servants can find them. Frodo disappears. He gives the ring to Tom. Tom holds it up. Tom puts it on his own finger. Tom does not vanish. He can see Frodo clearly, invisible to everyone else. He makes the ring disappear between his palms and reappear as though it is a parlor trick. He hands it back with the cheerfulness of a man returning a borrowed pen. Tolkien is not being subtle. He is showing you something that belongs to the deepest layer of his world. Tom Bombadil is not resisting the ring. He is not more powerful than the ring in some contest of wills. The ring simply has nothing to grip in his nature. There is no crack, no hunger, no unfulfilled desire where the corruption can enter. Tom's self is so complete, so rooted in what he already is, that the ring's promises land in him like seeds cast onto stone. At the Council of Elrond, Tolkien confirms this with surgical precision. Someone asks the obvious question, could they not give the ring to Tom for safekeeping? And Gandalf's answer deserves to be read very carefully. He says Tom would understand. He would take the ring, but he might forget it, or simply lose it. Not because he is absent-minded, because to Tom, the ring is a trifle. And then Gandalf adds something that changes everything. He says that if all else is conquered, Bombadil will fall, last as he was first. Last as he was first. Let that phrase sit with you for a moment. In the middle of a council discussing the fate of Middle-earth, the One Ring, the chain of causality that runs from Sauron's hand to every catastrophe of the Third Age, Tolkien has Gandalf confirm that Tom Bombadil is the first and the last. Not the most powerful, not the most dangerous, the oldest, the one who was here before everything else and will remain after everything else collapses. In letter 144, Tolkien is direct about Tom in a way that he rarely is about his own mythology. He describes Tom as representing something wholly untouched by the corruption of the rings, not resistant, untouched. He exists in a different relationship to power entirely. The things Sauron cares about, control, domination, the bending of other wills to a single purpose, are simply not categories that apply to Tom. He is not playing the game. He never was. He predates the game by so many ages that the game's rules are to him what the customs of a long-fallen civilization are to someone who watched it build and crumble and be forgotten by its own descendants. Tom Bombadil was here before the Dark Lord came from outside. He says this himself, in his own strange singing way, in his own house, to 4 hobbits who have no idea what they are sitting with. He was present before rivers and trees, before the first raindrop, before the first acorn. Tolkien's cosmology places the making of Arda at the absolute beginning of time, the shaping of the world through the music of the Ainur, the Valar descending to give it form, the long dark ages before even the elves arrived under starlight. And Tom was already there, not as a Valar, not as a Maiar, as something that even the Ainur cannot quite categorize, something that fits no schema, that answers to no lord, that has chosen its own relationship to the world, and will not be moved from it. Which means Tom Bombadil was present in the First Age, when Morgoth still walked Arda. He was present when the first dragons were made. Picture this, the deep north of Middle-earth in the First Age, in the iron fortress of Thangorodrim, where Morgoth has made himself the greatest darkness the world has ever known. He has armies, orcs and balrogs and wolves, and darker things. But he wants a weapon that thinks, a weapon that can speak, that can terrify with intelligence as well as force, that can understand what it is destroying and describe it in words that increase the horror. So he makes the fire drakes, creatures poured from his own diminishing spirit, carrying a fraction of the original darkness that Morgoth himself brought from outside Arda at the very beginning. Their fire is not an animal adaptation. It is a theological fact. It is the corruption of the original creative fire that Tolkien elsewhere associates with the Ainur's gift to the world, the same fire perverted by Morgoth's obsession with domination until it burns only to destroy. And somewhere to the west, in lands that will eventually become the Old Forest and the country around it, the eldest is walking. He does not go to Thangorodrim. He will not. Tom has already made his choice. Long before this moment, perhaps before the world was even shaped, he has renounced control. Not because he lacks the capacity for it, but because power over others is simply not what he is, and he has known this about himself since before anyone else in Arda was old enough to have a self to know. He watches from the margins, the way he always watches, singing, walking his land, knowing everything, changing nothing beyond his own borders. But he sees. He always sees. Smaug is descended from those first-age drakes. He is not one of them in power or scale, those ancient weapons that could lay waste to whole armies in an afternoon. And Calagon the Black was so vast that when he fell, he shattered mountain peaks. Smaug is a third-age creature, lesser in absolute terms, but he carries in his fire and his cunning the inheritance of what Morgoth built. He is not just a dragon who wants gold. He is the old darkness still running in the world, centuries after its maker was cast out beyond the walls of time itself. And this is what the Silmarillion tells you, that the Hobbit never quite reaches. In the chapters dealing with Morgoth's assault on Beleriand, Tolkien is explicit about the nature of his fire drakes. They are not natural creatures that arose through ordinary generations. They are made things, designed weapons, given intelligence and speech specifically so they could understand what they were destroying, could use that understanding as an additional instrument of terror. The speech of dragons is not incidental to their nature. It is their most dangerous feature. Smaug demonstrates this in The Hobbit with a precision that ought to chill you every time you read it. He is a liar and a truth-teller simultaneously, using accurate information to construct false impressions, drawing Bilbo into damaging admissions through flattery and misdirection, seeing instantly through darkness and magic and fog the worth and nature of everything in his presence. That is not animal cunning sharpened to a point. That is the weapon Morgoth designed, still functioning centuries after its maker was gone. But here is what nobody asks about Smaug's intelligence. If the fire drakes were made things, bred with purpose, descended from the corruption Morgoth carried from outside Arda, what is the nature of Smaug's fire as a theological fact within Tolkien's cosmology? Not just as a weapon, as an expression of what it means to carry Morgoth's inheritance in your chest. Tolkien is precise about fire and spirit in ways that reward careful reading. The Ainur who descended into Arda took the forms that expressed their innermost natures. Gandalf is a pilgrim, grey and wandering, carrying wisdom without display. Saruman is a courtier, white and ordered, carrying the seed of ambition that will eventually unmake him. The Balrog of Moria is fire and shadow given monstrous shape. A Maiar who followed Morgoth into corruption and was diminished by that choice, until its original form was replaced entirely by what it became in service to darkness. And Smaug carries in his chest a fire that is literally the product of Morgoth's creative violence, a perverted version of the original warmth Tolkien elsewhere describes as part of Arda's own living nature. Tom Bombadil was present before that fire was corrupted, before Morgoth's dissonance entered the music, before the note that was wrong at the beginning began to work its way through everything the Valar made. Tom was walking Arda in the age before Arda was broken, and his nature was fully formed in that original wholeness, and it has never been altered by anything that came after. He carries, in some sense, the memory of what Arda was before Morgoth touched it. Smaug carries, in his fire, one of the most concentrated expressions of what Morgoth did to that original world. If they were ever in the same place at the same time, what would Tom Bombadil have seen in that dragon's fire? This is where the canon ends, and the structured speculation begins. Because Tolkien never tells us whether Tom's range was always limited to the old forest and its surroundings. In the Third Age, yes, his power and his presence are clearly bounded. Gandalf at the Council of Elrond acknowledges this directly. The option of giving Tom the ring fails precisely because Tom's domain is not the whole world. What is outside his country is outside his care. But what was his country in the Second Age? In the First Age? In the age before the elves arrived? The man who was first, who was there before the trees, whose memory stretches back to the beginning of Arda, would not always have occupied a small territory in the northwest of Middle-earth. The borders came from his own choice. The renunciation was his own. And when he made it, and what the world looked like at the moment he drew those borders, is something Tolkien never specified. And in Letter 155, when Tolkien discusses Tom's nature directly, he says something that is easy to miss on a first reading. He says that Tom has renounced control. Not power, control. The distinction is everything. Tom is not without capacity to act on the world. He resisted the old man Willow, a creature of ancient and genuine malice. He dispersed the Barrow-wights, spirits of darkness that had survived from the days of the Witch King's dominion in Angmar. These are not trivial accomplishments. The evil in the Old Forest and the Barrow Downs is old and deep, in a way that most Third Age threats are not. Tom handled it with what appears to be minimal effort. He can act. He has simply chosen not to, beyond the borders he has drawn. And he drew those borders himself, at some moment in deep time that Tolkien leaves unmarked, for reasons that Tolkien leaves unstated. This renunciation is the absolute opposite of Smaug in every possible dimension. Picture this: the Lonely Mountain, Third Age, 2941. The tunnel is warm and dark, and smells of char and age, and treasure so old it has lost its metallic scent and begun to smell like stone. You are moving deeper than any reasonable being would go, and the breathing you hear ahead of you is like bellows in a forge, slow and rhythmic and vast. You round a bend and the world becomes Smaug. He is larger than the space he occupies seems able to contain, draped across the floor of a chamber built by dwarves for their own purposes, but claimed now by something that has made it entirely his. His body is like a hill that breathes, and then an eye opens, not to look for you. It opens because the eye knows you are there before it opens. The seeing begins before the opening, before the movement, before any signal that awareness has been activated. The eye opens because the awareness has already completed its assessment, and the eye is simply confirming what is already known. Smaug has been expecting something like this. He has been expecting something like this for a very long time. This is the deepest truth about Smaug that the Peter Jackson films never quite rendered. He is not a beast with intelligence. He is an intelligence that has chosen to live as a beast because it is more efficient. He owns the mountain. He owns the treasure. He owns, in his mind, the surrounding lands and the peoples who remember what it felt like to have Erebor standing between them and the north. His desire extends outward from his body, like the heat from his fire, claiming everything, touching everything, making everything his whether it knows it or not. And the most terrifying thing about him is not his fire or his size. The most terrifying thing is that he is content. Because Tolkien understood and built into the deepest structure of his world that Morgoth's greatest evil was not the wars or the burning of forests or the enslavement of peoples. It was what Tolkien calls the marring, the corruption of things that were made good. Morgoth poured himself into his works, his orcs, his dragons, his corrupted servants, the very substance of Arda that he spent ages claiming and distorting, and in doing so, he became less than he was. Tolkien uses the word diminishment repeatedly. The mightiest of the Ainur, the being of greatest original power in all of creation, gradually hollowed himself out through his own greed. He became, at last, too small to hold his own original form. By the time the host of Valinor came to end him, Morgoth was diminished to the point where his power was in his works, rather than in himself, and when those works were destroyed or scattered, there was almost nothing left. Smaug carries that inheritance. He is made from a principle that consumes itself. Tom Bombadil carries the opposite principle entirely. He is the spirit of something that does not consume itself. He does not build. He does not claim. He does not accumulate experience and call it wisdom, the way a very old and proud being might. He sings and walks and knows. And because he takes nothing from the world has taken nothing from him. He is as complete in the third age as he was before the first raindrop. The rings of power did not diminish him because he never reached for them. The wars of the ages did not hollow him out because he refused the principle of domination that makes those wars possible. He is the only being in Middle-earth who is exactly as whole as he was at the beginning. Now here is where it gets strange. Unfinished Tales gives us the closest thing to an answer that Tolkien ever wrote about the intersection of Tom Bombadil's world and Smaug's world, even though the two figures are never mentioned in the same sentence. In Gandalf's account of the events leading up to the quest of Erebor, in the section sometimes called The Quest of Erebor, Gandalf reveals the full reasoning behind his decision to organize the expedition with Thorin Oakenshield, and the reasoning is not primarily about restoring the dwarves to their homeland. It is not about the treasure. It is not even about Bilbo, not at its foundation. The reasoning is about Sauron. Gandalf had become increasingly alarmed by the presence of the necromancer in Dol Guldur, whom he and the White Council had already identified as likely being Sauron in a weakened but returning form. And one of his specific fears, one he states plainly in his account, is this: Sauron might make contact with Smaug, the great dragon of Erebor, with his intelligence and his fire and his location far in the north, could become a weapon for the returned Dark Lord. An army that Sauron did not need to feed or pay, or promise land to, because Smaug's motivations were already perfectly aligned with destruction. A dragon under any form of Sauron's direction would be something that no alliance of free peoples could easily stop. The White Council knew this. They debated it. and Saruman convinced them to do nothing. Because Saruman, at that point already beginning his long slide into corruption and self-interest, had calculated that Sauron's one ring was gone forever, drowned in the sea, and therefore the necromancer was only a shadow of what Sauron once was, manageable, watchable, not yet requiring action. The threat of Smaug was therefore, in Saruman's argument, containable within that framework. They could watch, they could wait. Gandalf disagreed, and Gandalf went and found Thorin Oakenshield without the council's formal blessing and arranged the entire quest of Erebor himself, because he saw what Saruman either did not see or chose not to acknowledge. The window for removing Smaug was closing, and if it closed before they had acted, everything else would become harder. Now pay attention to this next part, because it changes what the question of Tom and Smaug means. Gandalf is a Maiar. He was present in Valinor. He has knowledge and wisdom that spans the ages of Middle-earth. He knows the deep history. He knows what the fire drakes are and where they come from, and what their intelligence represents. And his assessment of Smaug is that the dragon is a catastrophic danger. Not generically, not because dragons are powerful, but because this specific dragon, in this specific location, at this specific moment in the Third Age, represents a piece that Sauron could slot into a picture that would end the free peoples of Middle-earth. Tom Bombadil is also in Middle-earth at this exact time. He is in his house, he is singing, he is walking his land and knowing everything within his borders and holding his edges against the ancient malice that has accumulated in the Old Forest and the Barrow Downs for centuries. And the eldest, who was present before the first Ainur, descended into Arda, who has watched every darkness rise and fall, and rise again across time too long to measure, would have known something that Gandalf only knew by analysis and fear. He would have known Smaug in his bones. Not because he had necessarily been in the same place as the dragon, but because the fire in Smaug's chest is the same fire, derived from the same source, carrying the same cosmological signature as the original darkness that Tom witnessed being introduced into Arda before any elf or man or dwarf drew breath. Tom would recognize what Smaug carries, the way someone who was present at the founding of a religion would recognize one of its relics, not by reading about it, by direct memory of the original. And here is what that means for the question we are building toward. Picture this. Sometime in the long centuries before Third Age 2770, before Smaug descended on Erebor and made it his, a great fire drake moving west and south from the withered heath, the desolate region in the far north, where the remnant broods of Morgoth's dragons lingered long after their maker was gone. The appendices give this in broad strokes. The dragons of the withered heath became more active in the late Third Age, as the shadow began to stir again, as whatever thin filament connected Sauron's awakening consciousness to the creatures of Morgoth's making began to vibrate with renewed purpose. Smaug was not the only dragon in the north, but he was the greatest. And in those long decades or centuries of movement before he found his final resting place, the greatest fire drake of the Third Age passed through enormous distances of Middle-earth. Distances that, at certain points, came into the general region of territories that Tom Bombadil's awareness, if not his active domain, would have reached. Tom would not have needed to see the dragon directly. His knowing is not dependent on physical proximity in the way that ordinary sight is dependent on line of vision. He perceives things within his country with a completeness that goes beyond the physical, and the border of his country is not a wall that blocks what is on the other side. It is a line he will not cross in action. What he perceives across it, in knowledge rather than intervention, is something Tolkien leaves entirely open. So imagine a morning in the old forest, the air thick with the green quiet that has nothing peaceful about it, where the trees are old and resentful, and the paths shift to lead wanderers astray. And Tom is walking, as he always walks, and he is singing, as he always sings, and somewhere to the north or northeast, past the edges of his country, past the border of his own choosing, the fire in a dragon's chest flares against the grey morning sky. Tom knows what that fire is, not knows in the sense of recognizing a species or a threat, knows in the sense of remembering. The fire that Smaug carries is a direct descendant of the fire Morgoth introduced into Arda before the elves were awake, a distortion of the original creative warmth that the Valar brought to the shaping of the world, twisted through Morgoth's desire for domination into something that burns only to destroy and to claim what the destruction leaves. Tom Bombadil was present when that fire was first wrung. He remembers what it was before Morgoth touched it. He is the only being in Middle-earth who carries that memory intact, without grief and without the corrosive weight of having been diminished by what came after. And what he sees in Smaug, if he perceives the dragon in that moment on that grey morning, is not a monster, it is an inheritor, a creature that did not choose its own fire, that cannot set it down, that burns because burning is what it was made to do, as completely and inevitably as a river runs because running is what water does on a slope. Smaug did not choose to be born of Morgoth's making. No dragon did. No orc did, torn as Tolkien suggests from captured elves in the depths of the First Age. The darkness in them is not their own darkness. It is Morgoth's darkness, installed before their first breath, running through them like a current they cannot interrupt. Tom, who has renounced control, who has set down the principle of domination so completely that it cannot even enter his nature, would look at Smaug and see something that the Council of Elrond, with all its wisdom and power, could not see. The tragedy in it, not the threat, the tragedy. A creature of genuine intelligence and ancient power, burning with a hunger that its maker installed, and that no force in Middle-earth can remove, carrying an inheritance so deep it goes to the marrow of what it is, incapable of the renunciation that would be its only cure. Tom would look at the fire in Smaug's chest and recognize it the way someone who knew a river before a dam was built would recognize the trapped water after. Still the same water, still carrying the same essential nature, but bent by constraint into something it was not made to be. Now think about what Smaug would perceive in Tom. Smaug's intelligence is predatory and total. His dragon sight, the ability to assess value and identify weakness, and read the worth of everything in his presence, is the most refined expression of Morgoth's original gift to his drakes, the intelligence designed to make destruction more effective. When Bilbo stands before him, invisible, Smaug perceives the hobbit through means that go beyond physical sight. He smells the age of the Shire on him, the weight of good food and pipe smoke and comfort. He reads the shape of Bilbo's theft in the single missing cup. He identifies, within moments, who Bilbo must be associated with, and what that association means for the threat to his hoard. That dragon sight, turned on Tom Bombadil, would find nothing. Not because Tom is invisible, because he has nothing that constitutes value in the framework Smaug uses to evaluate the world. Smaug reads everything in terms of what it can be taken for, what it is worth, what it would cost to acquire, what threat it presents to what he already has. Tom does not have possessions that can be taken. He does not have power that can be measured in the terms Smaug uses to measure power. He does not have a will that bends toward anything the ring or a dragon's fire could exploit. He is simply himself, completely and without remainder, and in the face of that completeness, Smaug's predatory intelligence would circle and find no entry. You cannot assess a being who has no desires you can threaten or fulfill. This is the deepest opposition in the Legendarium. Not Sauron versus Gandalf, not Morgoth versus the Valar. Tom Bombadil and Smaug, the renouncer and the inheritor, the being who was present before the fire was corrupted, and the being who carries the corruption as his most essential nature. Two anomalies in the ring's dominion, immune for opposite reasons, representing opposite poles of what Middle-earth's age and power can produce, and both of them, in the Third Age, are on the same side of the same world, breathing the same air, present in the same era of history. Here is where it gets strange. Here is the question that the Council of Elrond almost asked, and then didn't. When the decision was made to set Tom aside as a guardian of the ring, the reasoning was practical. His domain is bounded, his interest in the ring is non-existent, and outside his own country, he has no power. Correct on all counts. But the discussion stopped there. Nobody asked Tom whether he knew anything about Smaug. Nobody asked the eldest whether, in the long memory that stretches back to before the first dragon was made, he had any insight into the nature of Morgoth's fire drakes that might be useful to a council trying to manage the geopolitical threat posed by the last great one. Because by the time of the Council of Elrond, Smaug was dead. The problem had solved itself, with Bilbo's help and the help of a black arrow and a thrush and a man standing on a burning lake. The window that Gandalf had feared closing had stayed open just long enough. Smaug was gone, and the threat of his being used by Sauron was gone with him. But the question of what Tom knew, and when he knew it, and what the oldest being in Middle-earth understood about the last great dragon that even the Astari could only understand through analysis and fear, that question is still open. It is still open because Tolkien left it open, not by accident. He is one of the most deliberate writers who ever constructed a secondary world. He left it open because Tom Bombadil is deliberately outside the knowledge-sharing systems of the Legendarium. He does not attend councils. He does not send messages. He does not intervene in the politics of rings and dragons and the fate of kingdoms. He sings and knows and holds his borders. And whatever he perceives beyond those borders, he holds within himself, the way the oldest tree holds the memory of every season it has lived through, completely, without distortion, without the urgency of sharing. Pay attention to this, because this is where the emotional weight of the whole video lands. Tom Bombadil, in letter 155, is described as having renounced control. But Tolkien adds something to that description that is easy to glide past. He says that Tom has renounced control, not out of weakness, but out of a specific understanding of what control costs. Every being in Middle-earth who has reached for control, for domination, for the ability to bend other wills to a single purpose, has been diminished by the reaching. Morgoth, the greatest Ainur in creation, was reduced by his own greed until the form he wore at the end was a shadow of what he once was. Sauron, his greatest servant, poured so much of himself into the One Ring that when the ring was destroyed, he was destroyed with it. Saruman, who began as one of the Astari sent to contest Sauron's power, was hollowed out by his own desire for control until he ended as a diminished, petty villain in a small corner of the Shire. The principle is absolute in Tolkien's world. The desire to dominate consumes what does the desiring, always, without exception. Smaug has been consumed by it for centuries. He is vast and terrible and intelligent and completely imprisoned by his own nature. He cannot set down the fire. He cannot decide not to want the gold. He cannot look at the valley below Erebor and choose to let it be. His intelligence, the very feature that makes him most dangerous, is entirely in service to a desire that will never be satisfied, because the desire is not for any specific amount of gold or any specific kind of power. The desire is the fire itself, and fire does not have a stopping point. Tom Bombadil looked at this, at all of this, across the full length of Arda's history, and made a different choice. Not a choice to be uninvolved. He is involved, within his country, with everything. He knows the name of every tree and the history of every stone. He held the Barrow Wights at bay with his singing. He was present before the first elf woke under starlight. He is involved with existence itself, in a way that no other being in the Legendarium achieves. But he is involved without grasping, without claiming, without requiring any of it to be other than it is. That distinction between presence and possession, between knowing and controlling, between being entirely engaged with the world and being entirely free of the need to own any of it, is what Tolkien built Tom Bombadil to embody. And it is the thing that makes the hypothetical of Tom and Smaug in the same moment of awareness more philosophically loaded than any battle in the Legendarium. Because if Tom perceived Smaug, even from the distance of his own renounced borders, what he perceived was Morgoth's fire still burning in the world. The old darkness, the dissonance, the note that was wrong in the original music, carried forward through centuries, inherited by a creature that did not choose it and cannot set it down. And Tom did not intervene. Not because he could not. His power in his own country is genuine. Whether it extends to a dragon's fire at the edge of his awareness, whether the singing that dispersed barrow wights could reach a fire drake, is something Tolkien never specified, and we should not pretend to know. But the more important question is not whether Tom could have intervened in Smaug's eventual fate. It is whether intervention was the right understanding of his relationship to what Smaug represents. Because Tom is not playing the same game as everyone else. He is not on the side of the free peoples in the way Gandalf is on their side, as an active agent working to contest Sauron's return and protect what the long ages of Middle-earth have produced. He is outside all of that. He was outside it before Sauron was Sauron, before the rings were forged, before the line between darkness and light was drawn as a political and military fact rather than a cosmological one. His silence about Smaug, if he perceived the dragon at all, is not the silence of indifference. It is the silence of a being who has already lived through enough endings to understand that some fires have to run their own course. The dissonance in Arda does not resolve through opposition. Tolkien builds this into the structure of his mythology, across every age. The wars of the First Age did not end the evil that Morgoth introduced. They ended Morgoth. The evil survived in his servants and his creatures, and in the substance of Arda that he had spent ages corrupting. The Second Age did not end the evil that Sauron represented. It ended Sauron's body. He came back. The Third Age came down, at the end, to the destruction of the ring itself, and even that was not clean. Sauron was unmade. But Tolkien is explicit in his letters that the marring of Arda remains. The dissonance is woven into the world now, not as a removable foreign element, but as part of the texture of what Arda is. Tom knows this. He was present when the dissonance entered. He has watched every attempt to remove it. And he is at peace, in a way that Elrond is not at peace, in a way that Galadriel is not at peace, in a way that even Gandalf, for all his wisdom, is not at peace. Because his peace is not the peace of not knowing. It is the peace of knowing completely and having decided, at some depth of antiquity that Tolkien never maps, that presence without possession is the only response to a world that is both beautiful and broken, that does not itself become part of the breaking. This is the thing the video should leave you with. Not that Tom and Smaug met. Not that a meeting would have been dramatic or revelatory or decisive in any way, but what their hypothetical encounter reveals about the deepest structure of Tolkien's world, about what it means to be ancient, and what it means to be powerful, and what it means to look at the darkness that has been woven into the fabric of everything, and choose, freely and completely, not to add to it. Smaug is Morgoth's fire still burning in the Third Age, brilliant and terrible and completely imprisoned by its own nature. Tom Bombadil is Arda's original joy, still walking in the Third Age, quiet and complete and entirely free. And between those two things, the whole history of Middle-earth is suspended. Which brings us back to the question that started this, the one we have been circling through all the lore, through the letters and the Silmarillion and the unfinished tales and the Fellowship chapters. Not the surface question about whether a meeting happened, the question underneath it. The one that the Legendarium has set up and refused to answer. Did Tom Bombadil stay silent about Smaug because he had no power over what Morgoth had made? Or because he had already seen enough of the world's endings to know that some fires have to burn themselves out? And here is what I think the text implies, though it never states it. Both things are true, and they are the same thing. Tom's silence is not passivity or failure or cowardice. It is the expression of a wisdom so old it has passed through every form of grief and urgency, and the desire to fix things and come out on the other side as something that simply knows. He does not interfere because he has learned, at a depth that no other being in Middle-earth can quite reach, that the fire in Smaug's chest is not a thing that can be quenched from the outside. It can be killed. Smaug can be killed, and was. But the principle that made Smaug, Morgoth's original dissonance, cannot be killed from outside. It has to resolve through its own consequences. The ring had to be destroyed by the very desire it created. Smaug had to be brought down by the weakness that his arrogance refused to acknowledge. The darkness has to consume itself, because the alternative, fighting it directly in a way that requires you to match its power, is to risk becoming what you are fighting. Tom has been watching the darkness consume itself across the full length of Arda's history. He has seen it enough times to know the shape of how it goes. And he is still there, still singing, still walking his country, still the eldest, still exactly as complete as he was before the first dark thing was made. The last great dragon of the Third Age burned for 171 years on the treasure of a stolen mountain, and then fell to a black arrow and a lake full of fire, leaving behind a political vacuum that the dwarves and men and elves spent several days nearly going to war over. Smaug died as he lived, at the center of a contest about possession and power and who had the right to claim what. And Tom Bombadil has never, in all the long ages of Arda, owned a single thing he would grieve to lose. That, in the end, is the answer to every question this video has been orbiting. Not a battle resolution, not a lore revelation, but a reckoning with what Tolkien built both of these figures to show us. That the oldest thing in Middle-earth, and the last inheritor of the darkest fire, would stand at opposite ends of a question that is finally about freedom. What does it mean to be free? Smaug would tell you it means owning everything within reach and protecting it with fire and intelligence. Tom would not answer, because Tom does not deal in propositions. He sings, he walks. He is present to the world without requiring the world to be his. One of them ended in a lake of fire, destroyed by what he refused to relinquish. The other is still there, last as he was first. If this question has reached into something you think about in Tolkien's world, the kind of question that does not have a clean answer, but opens something instead of closing it, drop your thoughts below. Because the legendarium is vast enough that everyone who reads it carefully finds a slightly different Middle-earth, and I want to know which version of this question lands hardest for you. Did Tom know? Could he have acted? And would it have changed anything if he had? If you want to keep following these questions into the parts of the legendarium that the films never touched, subscribe, because we are only at the beginning of what Tolkien actually built.